Welcome back to Risk. How to live with a more powerful China is one of the big questions, I think, of our generation. And we were talking in the last episode about how China sees itself, how Chinese leaders in particular, because that's the most important thing really to understand in terms of how China's going to act in the world. How do Chinese leaders see China's role in the world? And through working on this book that I'm talking about and reading from in this series, I interviewed about 100 people, travelled across China, read obviously extensively and doing the PhD research that underpinned this book, trying to understand, and this is just my take on it, but trying to understand the way that China sees its role in the emerging world. It's exceptionalism. And in a sense, China does have an exceptionalism, just as people talk about the US as having American exceptionalism. America believes it has a particular role in the world, and we could talk about that, but today we're talking about China's belief that it has a particular role in the world, and what does that mean for all of the rest of us. So I'm going to read a little bit more today about how Chinese scholars see China as a challenger in the international system to the United States, but they don't tend to see China as a challenger that wishes to overthrow the United States, at least that's what they say. They don't tend to see the world as a zero-sum game, as generally in the American discourse it is imagined that we're in a zero-sum competition between one world power and another. The Chinese scholars who write about international relations tend to retain confidence that absolute gains can be achieved through increased Chinese participation in global governance. So absolute gains, meaning gains will accrue, will come to all of the players in the international system. So China's imagination of the world system is that it's a game in which everybody can win. Whereas we know the Western conception is much more that it is a game in which only one side can win. So this is a difference in perception, and it's worth drilling down and investigating how the Chinese elites and how Chinese scholars and Chinese leaders think, so that we can predict how they might act in future. So a widespread judgment in China that the US is in relative decline informs the debate about how China will wield its increasing influence. This is not perceived as a showdown with the US, but rather a new accommodation, as the US is still widely considered within Chinese elites to be still by far, and for some time yet, the dominant global power. It has been suggested, nonetheless, within China, that the domestic dysfunction that the US, and indeed US and European mismanagement of the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, convinced China's leaders that the power transition in Asia, the power transition in the world, bringing more power to Asia, would occur perhaps faster than they had expected. And so this is an important point, I think. And I was doing the research for this book during COVID and after COVID, and it certainly was the case that Chinese people and Chinese leaders and scholars became more confident about their own model, more confident about their own strategy as a country, as a great power, and believed increasingly, and I think this is still true today, believed increasingly that the US is becoming dysfunctional and is declining. Now, I, as I've said previously, don't necessarily subscribe to that view, but I do think it's worth us understanding that that is the way that the US is perceived within China by many, not by everyone. There's still a lot of admiration for the United States as the largest and most powerful country in the international economy, and also America's obvious military might. There's a respect for that, but equally there is a belief that the US is in some sort of a decline, and this is leading to a hubris, to a confidence that China has. Also, and this is important, Samuel Huntington's book, The Clash of Civilizations, is widely read in China, and indeed the geopolitical competition that's underway is understood to be more about identity just as much as it's about power, with the US representing Western civilization and democracy, of course, as part of that, while China perceives itself as representing Eastern civilization and the developing world. And so this leads to the argument within China, and we hear it in other parts of the developing world as well, that we're going to need to seek a new balance, that the international system is going to need to become more balanced, more multipolar. And so this is a logical conclusion in the Chinese thinking, whereas, as we've discussed before, it's not so logical in Western thinking. Multipolarity is feared in Western thinking generally. It's generally seen as a threat, whereas to China, multipolarity is seen as an opportunity. Now, external observers, of course, outside of China, expect that China's leaders will remain geopolitically focused on building capabilities in areas of strategic vulnerability and seek a Sino-centric, a China-centric system of maritime security, of regional trade routes and new technologies. In the wake of Trump's trade war and the shift in Western opinion against China that's happened in recent years, there has been a lively academic debate within China that perhaps its government has overreached. Perhaps China has seized opportunities too soon, generating as a result a backlash in the West. This is a lively discussion that's going on within Chinese academia. On balance, within China, though, its leaders are understood to be more focused domestically on China's economic development goals rather than great power expansionism, cognizant of the risks of triggering a backlash that would damage China's growth trajectory. So much of this was thinking from a few years ago, and so it could be argued that things have moved on a little, that China has begun to realise that actually this geopolitical competition is inevitable, or it could be argued that they see an opportunity with the second Trump administration to strike some sort of deal. So this is very important for us to understand, I think. Now, to date, as we know, China has been a major beneficiary and therefore an advocate of economic interdependence, which has been a real theme of my discussion in these episodes, this question of interdependence. And China's been a real champion of the multilateral system that underpins that because it's been a beneficiary. So Xi Jinping has taken up the mantle of champion of globalization and the right of the developing world to benefit from access to markets and to share in global decision-making, as well as to share in global prosperity. China has been a strong supporter of global institutions such as the WTO and such as the World Health Organization, while the US, of course, in recent years has sometimes been undermining those very organizations in its pursuit of a nationalist America First agenda, built on a perception that the US has been losing out from interdependence with China. China, remember, has been benefiting, so believes in interdependence. This thrust China into the position of champion of multilateralism, providing China with a platform to advocate for further democratization of world order. At Davos, Xi Jinping famously made a comprehensive defense of globalization, while noting the inadequate representation of the emerging and developing economies in global economic governance, and that rules had not kept up with new industries, proposing that only his concept of a shared future could embrace converging interests and interdependence. So very different set of language coming out of China than what is coming out of the West. Language is only language, but even so, it's worth us analysing. Xi Jinping has subsequently outlined further broad frameworks for development and common security in a series of initiatives responding to what he frequently describes as changes unseen in a century, including proposing a global development initiative at the BRICS summit in 2021 and a global security initiative at the Boao Forum in 2022. The Global Development Initiative pledges a series of Chinese development funding initiatives aligned with the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And, like the Belt and Road Initiative, has had more than 100 countries across the developing world eager to sign up, building China's norm-shaping influence further. The Global Security Initiative is an even bolder challenge to US global power, eschewing alliances, so turning away from the question of alliances. And it's described, this Global Security Initiative is described by an influential Chinese think tank called the China Institutes of Contemporary International Relations as a rejection of absolute security at the expense of others, as exhibited in traditional great power competition, that you can only have absolute security if someone else is lacking in security, in favour of a cooperative security concept that understands humankind as one indivisible security community and adopts the traditionally stated Chinese principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries, non-interference in other countries' internal affairs, and respect for the development paths and social systems independently chosen by the people of each country. Now, this reassuring language that China believes in common security, that it believes that it is possible to have a security that comprehends the needs of every player in the game, if you like. So it's not a zero-sum game, it's a game in which everyone wins. This kind of language is very potent, it's very attractive in the developing world. But the reassuring language fails to reassure observers in the West. That the term indivisible security aligned with the kind of rhetoric that comes out of Russia, and indeed, just as Russia was invading its neighbouring country, Ukraine, Russia was using language like indivisible security. And this, of course, as we know, the invasion of Ukraine followed China and Russia entering into a so-called no limits partnership in early 2022. Excuse my stumbling on that year. And so this has reinforced actually the West's commitment to systemic contest in response to China's narratives about common security. So we've got two different languages being spoken, and we're not comprehending each other. China's rise, its proclamation of a shared future, and its geo-economic initiatives to fund infrastructure connectivity across the developing world and to become a leader in transformative digital technologies in the context of the shifting world order raise a range of fears in the neighbourhood. But Asian responses should not be assessed only through Western eyes. Asia's scholars, as well as its governments, as we've discussed earlier, tend to exhibit a higher tolerance for pragmatism, complexity, ambiguity and multipolarity in the region, rather than echoing Western normative binary narratives. Western thinking tends to be black and white. Asian thinking, regardless of where you are in Asia, tends to be much more complex, and a comprehension that multipolarity is likely, whereas I think in Western thinking multipolarity is still resisted as just a threat that can somehow be constrained from actually happening. Viewed from within the region, there is much more going on, therefore, than simply US-China contest. None of the major actors in the region would be expected to passively allow China to become strategically dominant, but neither will most of them align with the US against China. The region of the world with the largest population, long either isolated, conflict-ridden or colonised, has enjoyed compounding benefits from its turn to both regional interdependence and trans-regional global interdependence with the advanced economies. The growth of Asian economic power and trans-regional economic interdependence has become a key feature of the new international system. This phenomenon was made possible by the stability of the region as guaranteed by the US security umbrella as well as open markets, and could be described as the inevitable result of neoliberalism pursued by the advanced economies. In recent decades, the prosperity of the region has become increasingly bound up with China's prosperity, and peace and cooperation are therefore likely to be prioritised by countries in Asia, at least most of the time, over geopolitical confrontation and conflict. Chinese and a diverse set of other regional leaders can therefore be expected to perceive benefits from continued engagement in complex interdependence, at the same time as risk mitigation within an ongoing geopolitical power shift. So undoubtedly, there is a power shift going on. Undoubtedly, there is a geopolitical competition going on. But within Asia, there are many imperatives here to retain geoeconomic and geopolitical interdependence. So there are two scenarios here playing out, and probably many more than two. But at the extremes, one is the economic interdependence continues, and we find some way to enjoy some kind of cooperative security in the region, or we have the binary conflict.